Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Module 11, Managing Volunteers and Boards. The title of this module should have been reversed because we will spend more time on boards than on volunteers. Of course, many of the same principles apply because, after all, boards are composed of volunteers. So here's an overview of this module. We're going to look at the structure of nonprofit boards, the roles of nonprofit boards, who serves on boards, board cultures, bylaws, the role of the board chair, keys to managing boards, and then we're going to talk about keys to managing volunteers. So here's a typical board structure. You will find this structure or something similar in the vast majority of nonprofit organizations. It begins with the board chair sitting at the top of the organization, followed by an executive committee consisting of typically 4 senior officers, including the board chair himself or herself, the vice chair, the treasurer, and the secretary. We'll discuss the role of the board chair later in this module. The vice chair is typically someone who has worked his way or her way up the ranks and is typically next in line to become the board chair. The treasurer is responsible for ensuring the organization's financial integrity, and the secretary is responsible for recording the minutes of board meetings and documenting any votes taken at board meetings, among other roles. Some executive committees will include selected committee chairs. And in some organizations, the executive committee serves to address issues or decision points in between board meetings. In others, it plays a central role in directing the organization and determining policy. Beneath the executive committee are your committee chairs. Here are 5 committees that you will find in most nonprofit organizations. Development or fundraising, communications. This committee is responsible for all of the public relations and nowadays for the website of an organization. The finance committee is responsible for the budget of the organization and as well for overseeing the investments of the organization's endowment or its reserve fund. The program committee is responsible for overseeing that part of the organization that is involved in implementing the programs or the services. And then the nominating committee is one that is often overlooked, but I think is one of the most important committees. The nominating committee is responsible for screening new board members, for nominating committee chairs, and for recommending committee assignments. Again, this function is too often underestimated by many nonprofits, but the turnover, the rotation I should say, in committee chairs, in the executive committee, and at the board chair level, all comes out of the work of the nominating committee. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So who serves on boards? These should all be familiar to you. Now, people who are connected to the mission in some way, people who can add value to the organization. Typically that's in the form of writing a check, making a donation, but people can add value through services as well, perhaps legal services or accounting services. People who are willing to meet the obligations of board members. Sometimes this question is never even asked. People are just invited to be on the board, and there's an assumption that they know the obligations and are willing to meet them. That's not always true. People who can raise money and open doors, and of course people who are willing to write a check. One of the fundamental responsibilities of board members is to support the organization financially. So what do nonprofit boards do? Again, these should all be familiar to you. Certainly ensuring mission integrity. There are times when organizations will drift off mission. They'll develop programs or they'll add programs on that are not fully in keeping with what the mission of the organization is. So the board is responsible for ensuring that everything the organization does is connected to its mission. Program integrity, ensuring that, again, programs are adopted that are in line with the mission of the organization, financial integrity, ensuring that the annual budget is sound, ensuring that there's a legitimate reserve fund in the event of a downturn in fundraising, or ensuring that the reserve fund and the endowment, if the organization has an endowment, is properly managed. Legal and ethical compliance, ensuring that the nonprofit complies with all legal rules, and there are many, and certainly with all ethical standards. The board also hires and evaluates the CEO. It's the only position that the board is supposed to hire and evaluate. The board clearly has a major role in fundraising, and finally the board is responsible for recruiting new members to replenish its ranks. So in this slide, I talk about board cultures. You know, just as organizations take on culture, so do boards. And board cultures don't always influence organizational culture. Sometimes they're separate, but oftentimes the culture of the board is reflected in the culture of the organization. Now, I'm an old political science major, and I draw on that background here. So here are 6 typical board cultures. One is monarchy. This is where one person is the dominant force in the organization. And that person is typically the board chair, and often that person is also the founder of the organization. An oligarchy is where a small group of people dominate the board. Perhaps these are people who have been with the board a long time. Perhaps this group of people are close personally, but it's a small clique that dominates the board at the expense of the board at large. The plutocracy is boards that are dominated by those who can give the most money. Boards where people can buy their way or donate their way to positions of leadership. An aristocracy is another board culture. This is typically where founders of organizations hold on for many, many years. And it's certainly an appropriate role for founders of organizations. They should always have some influence. They should always be revered. But when founders of organizations continue to hold on to power and not share that power with others, then the board tends to take on the tone of an aristocracy. Number 5 is anarchy. This is where there are no controls. This is where there are no dominant forces in a board. It's a free-for-all. It's chaotic. And then finally, my favorite, constitutional democracy. Let's talk about constitutional democracy and why I think that board culture works best. So there you can see an image that we've all seen many, many times. This is obviously a replica of the United States Constitution. And so what does the U.S. Constitution do for our country? Well, it establishes the centers of power in the forms of the 3 branches of government. It establishes who is eligible to serve in those branches of government and how they're chosen, and and the duration of the terms that they serve. And it defines what are the powers of each one of those branches of government. So the Constitution is our bedrock. The Constitution, whenever we have questions about whether or not government is exercising its authority properly, we turn to the Constitution for guidance. And this is where the Supreme Court plays a critical role in our democracy. So what is the equivalent of for a nonprofit organization? It's your bylaws. If you've not heard this term before, let me explain what it is. Every organization should have a governing document that, just like the U.S. Constitution, establishes the officers of the organization, how those officers are chosen, what the duration of their terms will be, how many consecutive terms they can serve in a particular position, what the key committees are. What are the standing committees? These are the committees that will always be there unless the bylaws are modified. and who's eligible to chair those committees and for how long, and what are the main functions of those committees, and what are their responsibilities. All of this is laid out in an organization's bylaws, and they become the organization's constitution. What happens is that most organizations have bylaws, and I would venture to say that most organizations don't really pay close attention to their bylaws, that the organization is governed more by custom and tradition, sometimes fiat, rather than the bylaws themselves. So here again are the things that should be identified in bylaws: your officers, your committees, your elections, your terms of service, your powers and responsibilities. Board meetings. When are the board meetings? How frequently are the board meetings? What constitutes a board meeting? Parliamentary procedures. If somebody wants to adopt a new policy for the organization, what is the procedure for doing that? The conflict of interest. Bylaws should include a statement in which each board member declares that he or she is not gaining any financial or any other sort of benefit through their relationship as a board member of the organization. And then number 9, the annual evaluation. This is where the board evaluates the executive director of the organization and where the board can evaluate its own performance. So I mentioned we were going to talk about the chairman of the board. Here we're not really going to talk about Frank Sinatra. For those of you of a certain generation, you know that Frank was the chairman of the board. But here we're going to talk about what are the responsibilities of the chairman of the board. It is the most important role, it's the most critical role in this whole subject of the nonprofit board. The board chair is responsible for the overall organization management and to ensure the integrity, the financial integrity, the program integrity, the mission integrity. All of those, of course, are the responsibility of the entire board, but it's really the board chair that has the foremost responsibility and is ultimately answerable for all of those. The board chair chairs the board meetings. He communicates regularly with the CEO. The board chair should be recruiting new board members. Certainly all of the directors can recruit new board members, but the board chair should be out there asking most often. Ditto for major gift fundraising. It is critical that the board chair play an active role in fundraising. Those of you who are in fundraising know that prospects and donors are glad to speak with major gift officers, and we have a vital role. But if you want to get that ultimate gift from a person, they need to be connected to the president, the CEO of the organization, and they need to have a relationship with the board chair. Not always. There are many board chairs that don't want to fulfill a role in fundraising, but it always works best when the board chair is active in fundraising. And certainly the board chair serves as the chief spokesperson for the organization. Any media interviews ought to first include the board chair, and failing that, the CEO of the organization. So what about managing boards? Let's segue from boards managing themselves to your role in managing a board. Now let's assume here that you are either an executive director or that you head up a function that has a corresponding board committee. So maybe you're the chief development officer and you report to and work closely with the chair of the development committee. Or let's say that you're the chief financial officer, you work closely with the chair of the finance committee. Here are the things that you need to be able to do in terms of your management of boards. Relationships. So much of what we do in every aspect of philanthropy and fundraising comes down to relationships. And it's certainly true with board members. Get to know your board members. Speak with them as frequently as you can. Interact with them as much as you can. Visit them at their offices, in their homes, however it is that they prefer to interact with you, but get to know them. Build those relationships. Certainly follow your bylaws. I alluded to this earlier. It does no good to have a set of bylaws on the shelf collecting dust. An organization must follow the bylaws. This is part of the role of the secretary of the organization to ensure fidelity to the bylaws. And certainly you as the executive director of an organization can frequently refer back to the bylaws or encourage board members to use bylaws in making their decisions. A CEO should attend committee meetings. Now this certainly adds to the workload of the CEO, but it's a good idea for the CEO to attend the program committee meetings, so he or she is fully up to speed on program, but also it enables the CEO to get to know the chair of the program committee. I'm using that as an example. It could be any of the committees. Planning your board meetings. I've experienced over the years boards that will think about what they're going to talk about at the next board meeting a couple of days before the board meeting, maybe 24 hours before the board meeting. Board meetings need to be planned 4 weeks, 6 weeks out. What are the agenda items? What needs to come up for a vote? Getting input from board members as to what they would like to discuss at the next meeting. Any special speakers that are coming to the next meeting. Anyone who is giving a report needs to be alerted that they will be speaking at the next board meeting. It takes 4 to 6 weeks to plan out a board meeting, and there should be 4 board meetings a year, minimally. Certainly, communication. Communicate, communicate, communicate. This means calling board members, visiting board members, attending the committee meetings, using email where appropriate, but picking up the phone also. All of the things that we do to build relationships as managers with coworkers, as frontline fundraisers or program officers, building relationships with our donors and our prospects. A CEO needs to communicate effectively and build those relationships with his or her board. Let me, before we get to managing volunteers, let me take a step back. My experience tells me that executive directors often succeed in managing down, that is, managing the organization, more so than they do managing up, managing the board. It may be the most challenging task in all of nonprofit management, managing up. If you find yourself with a well-organized, professional, and friendly board, you'll be able to focus proper attention on running the organization. But if not, if you have any of those dysfunctional board cultures that I described earlier, you're going to have a difficult time, and it's going to consume a large amount of your time, and it's going to make managing up very difficult. So now let's turn to managing volunteers. Of course, board members are volunteers, but here I'm speaking about non-board members, people who serve on volunteer fundraising committees or who volunteer for volunteer on the program side of an organization. I'm not so much speaking about the person who comes to the office once a week to help out or who comes to a special event to help you with registration, although that person is important too. Here I'm talking about the people, the volunteers that perform regular and vital services for your organization. First, recognition. Earlier in this course we talked about the universal desire for recognition. Well, this is especially true for volunteers because some of us get recognized every Friday or every other Friday with a paycheck, and volunteers do not. And so, therefore, the recognition coming from the staff person is vitally important. So do you properly thank volunteers? Do you show them recognition in front of their peers or in front of other staff members? Do you have awards for your top volunteers each year? These are small steps that mean a great deal to a volunteer. Talk about job descriptions. You might not think you would need a job description for a volunteer, but there are some roles that volunteers play where job descriptions are very, very important. For example, if someone is a tour guide at a museum or at a zoo, or someone volunteers to rescue animals, or if somebody, as with an organization I used to know, court-appointed special advocates, these were volunteers who went out to make sure that the social service system dealing with foster children was performing its role properly and these kids were being taken care of. These types of roles require job descriptions and they require training as well. So this is all part of managing volunteers. And likewise, for these kinds of critical roles, you're going to want to have an annual evaluation. And volunteers will, I think, most volunteers will welcome an annual evaluation. There may be some who say, look, why am I being evaluated? I'm here to give up my time and my energy. Isn't that enough? But most volunteers see their volunteer work as a second job, which is a labor of love as opposed to perhaps what their first job is. And they appreciate the recognition, and many will even look forward to the annual evaluation because they take their work seriously. You should also award top-performing volunteers with increased responsibility, just as an employee who is a top performer once added responsibility, so too do volunteers. In fact, it is probably the highest form of recognition that you can give. What about the other side of the coin, where a volunteer is disruptive? Do you have a system in place for dealing with these difficult volunteers? You can certainly fire volunteers without the same risk of litigation you face with employees. So you might think that, well, progressive discipline isn't that important. But to avoid disrupting the organization, to avoid the volunteer becoming a disruptive force, you should have some form of progressive discipline in place so that when the time comes that you do have to let a volunteer go, you will have some history documented about that volunteer's performance. So this concludes Module 11. I know we only touched the surface of this subject. We could certainly go into any one of these topics much more deeply. But I hope you gained an appreciation for the management issues involved with boards and other volunteers, particularly as it applies to boards. The best way to promote healthy governance, I want to repeat, is to have a viable set of bylaws in place that are applied every year and that are updated as needed every few years. Remember, constitutional democracy works best in the nonprofit sector. Thank you, and we'll see you in Module 12.